Hello everyone and welcome to today's session. My name is Kendra Bosworth. I'm the Manager of Professional Development and Programs at ACSL, and I'll be facilitating this session. Also from ACSL, we have Kat Beavis, Manager Communications, who will be assisting through this session as well. If you have any questions or need any support, please reach out to us through the chat. Now, before we start, I recognise that I am facilitating this session from Gundungurra country, and the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are all joining from today. We honour the First Nations peoples, culture and connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. ACSL acknowledges the lifelong trauma of abuse victims and survivors and their families, the failure of the Catholic Church to protect, believe and respond justly to children and adults at risk, and the consequent breaches of community trust. Please be aware that this session may contain content that you find confronting. If you start to feel distressed, please use your own judgment and ensure you are safe. It's okay to withdraw if you need to, physically or psychologically, and you can find support resources on the ACSL website. So today, I am pleased to introduce our presenter, Father Brian Lucas. Father Brian is a priest of the Archdiocese of Sydney, ordained in 1980. He is currently the National Director of Catholic Mission and a member of the Finance Council of the Pontifical Mission Society. Catholic Mission is the Pope's international mission agency in Australia, an international organisation that partners with communities, helping them to flourish by supporting grassroots or projects, including healthcare, education and spiritual care. Their network of religious and lay missionaries operates in Africa, Asia, Europe, Oceania, and the Americas. Brian's session today will draw on his extensive experience and focus on safeguarding in international contexts. This session is designed to promote good child safeguarding practice amongst Australian missionaries who engage with children in an international context. The aim is to ensure that anywhere that Australian missionaries minister to children, that the safety and well-being of children will be prioritised and promoted. While Brian will be doing most of the talking today, we would love to hear from you. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to add them to the chat throughout the session. Kat and I will collate your questions and comments and present them to Brian towards the end of today's session. And as a reminder, this session is being recorded, so if you don't want your image included in the recording, please turn your cameras off. We will be ensuring that you are muted so that Father Brian can present with no interruptions. And with all of that, welcome. Welcome, Father Brian Lucas.
Well, good morning to everyone, and thank you for the invitation to present this material. We're going to consider some of the issues relating to safeguarding of children and vulnerable adults, but within the context of international activities. Before I outline the themes that I'll develop, I should make a brief comment about my own involvement in safeguarding, because this is a very sensitive area, and our attitudes, the approach we take to the issues that arise are very much coloured by our own experiences. My first involvement with child abuse goes back to 1975 as a legal aid solicitor representing children in the Sydney Children's Court, so 49 years ago. In November 1987, in company with Father John Usher, who was the then director of Centre Care in Sydney, we were invited by Cardinal Clancy to address the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference plenary meeting. There were storm clouds on the horizon in Canada and the United States, and we recommended then to the bishops and the religious that they establish a specialist committee to develop protocols for responding to complaints of sexual abuse. And then in 1992, Catholic Church Insurances sent me on a study tour, and I tested our draft protocol with church authorities in the US and Canada. That protocol was then revised, and I was on the committee which Bishop Jeffrey Robinson chaired that developed what came to be known as Towards Healing. Now, over those almost 50 years, there has been a dramatic shift in our understanding of what constitutes the abuse of children, and most especially the damaging effects of that abuse and its long-term impact. As I'll explain shortly, the 50 years of learning in Australia has not necessarily been paralleled everywhere else in the world. So some of the themes that we will cover: what is abuse in the international context and awareness and understanding, What do we mean by vulnerable adults? The cultural context and sensitivity, and I'll delay on that a little while because that is very important in understanding our approaches. What the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Australian Council for International Development, what their expectations are. I've got a lot of material on that in the paper, and if we're running a bit short of time, you'll be able to find that very easily on their respective websites. The same with the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission External Conduct Standards. I'll say something briefly about modern slavery, some of the issues and responses there. And how do we manage safeguarding from a distance? What are a couple of the techniques we can put in place to ensure that what's going on a long way away is something we have control of? And then something on risk assessment and management. In the developing countries, there is still a problem for some people who do not think that this is a problem. So when I gave a presentation on this issue to the General Assembly of the Pontifical Missions General Assembly 2018, there were still some signs of resistance, especially from some of the African nations. But the PMS leadership was very supportive, and they invited Father Hans Zollner. Many of you will know that name or probably had presentations from him, one of the leading experts, a Jesuit at the Gregorian University. And in 2019, he did give a very detailed presentation at the General Assembly, and I think won the hearts of many of those who had previously been somewhat resistant. And this is his list of what we might regard as being abuse: physical violence, corporal punishment, armed violence, child labour, child marriage, pornography, recruitment by armed forces or armed groups, child trafficking, children without parental care, disabilities, separation in emergencies. I'll say a little bit in detail about female genital mutilation and some statistics about that. Landmines, one of our big programs of Catholic Mission in Cambodia relates to the damage done by landmines. Sexual exploitation of vulnerable adults, peer-to-peer sexual activity, and sexual violence against children. We haven't got time to go into all of the detail about all of that, and nor do we have time really to go into the history. But I think a brief overview of the history is important, just to alert us to the reality that where we are in Australia 50 years after I was first involved in these things is not the same everywhere else in the world. And the position we have arrived at today, it took quite some time to develop. So I've got just there some of the brief history to remind us of what happened. Australia got going pretty well in the late 80s. There was the development then of what came to be known as the Anglophone group, and some of you perhaps have participated in those meetings. Went to the first one in Chicago. It was a group of people involved in child protection issues from the English-speaking countries, and that became quite a significant group in also, I think, shaping some of the Vatican policy development. And both Archbishop Philip Wilson and Bishop Jeffrey Robinson were very instrumental in that. You know about our Royal Commission, and there have been similar inquiries in other places and reports in other countries. And the reactions, there was a lot of denial at the beginning. This is just a beat up. Then there was confusion. People were anxious. Is this really true? Then people responded, well, this is just a media attack on the church. And then another response, well, it's just about greedy lawyers and victims wanting money. There was certainly a loss of confidence in clergy, a lot of disaffiliation from the church, a lot of anger at bishops and church leaders for covering up. But I think for many, many people, it was just this sense of helplessness. You know, what can I do about all of that? And some of those feelings, of course, are still there. We have to recognise that. But there's also a lot of simplistic analysis that has to be unpacked. It's not quite so simple as saying all bishops colluded in covering up. And as we've discovered, of course, with other events more recently, this is a problem that is very widespread. There was a story on the ABC News just recently in New South Wales, the litigation involving historic sex abuse has had a 900% increase in the last decade. So the response of the Holy See, it was slow to react, didn't understand the problem, how widespread it was. Then it was, oh, well, it's a Western problem. Then some people thought, well, look, this is not really such a big issue legally. It's a moral weakness that can be cured by penance and sending the priest on a retreat. A very, naive approach. Then there was defensiveness. Well, this is connected to celibacy. If priests weren't celibate, we wouldn't have this problem, without any recognition that the majority of offenders are not celibates in other contexts. Then there was confusion about the link to homosexuality. The canon law had a bias towards protecting clergy. The law was written in a way that was really there to protect clergy from overreaching bishops. And so processes and procedures tended to favour the accused clergy. It took ages and ages for matters to be properly dealt with. But eventually there was an openness to an acknowledgement, and I'd give enormous credit to Archbishop Charles Scicluna, the Archbishop in Malta. He was an official in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. I had a lot to do with him over some years, and he did a lot of work to really raise the profile of this problem at the level of the Holy See. Then, of course, they've established a formal commission, and there are requirements for policies in every diocese. But the official position is pretty clear. Pope Francis said in 2023, safeguarding minors and vulnerable persons must be a priority for everyone in the Church. The principles of respect for the dignity of all, for right conduct and a sound way of life, and I've emphasised this, must become a universal rule independent of people's culture, and I'll dwell on that shortly, independent of people's culture or economic and social condition. So, advocating, though, for good safeguarding policies and practice is still a work in progress. So what do we mean by vulnerable adults, which has been tacked on to the abuse of children in the category? The term is somewhat ambiguous. If you do a search of the local literature here, there'll be a lot of literature on the notion of elder abuse. And I just put that on the record very briefly. Most of the literature will refer to residential aged care or the financial exploitation of older people by those who have responsibility for managing their affairs. And the Australian Law Reform Commission prepared a report on the legal issues, and it spoke about at-risk adults. I won't go into the detail of all of that, but just to be aware that elder abuse or the reference to vulnerable adults are a bit coterminous in the Australian context. That's not what we're dealing with. We're talking about a different cohort of vulnerable adults. And these are people who are at risk of sexual exploitation through mental or physical disabilities, the social context, which leaves them disempowered. They're vulnerable to pressure, harassment from others, or there's the abuse of power or authority within a particular social context. I mentioned too the vulnerability of religious women. In 2020, the Motu Proprio Authenticam Charismatis, Pope Francis amended Canon 579. That's the canon that enables a local bishop to establish a religious congregation. And there were instances of some exploitation of that, establishing what purports to be a religious congregation of women, but is simply not much more than cheap labour for the bishop. And so the permission of the Holy See is now required to establish a local community. And then we have the sad scandal of exploitation of religious women by clergy. I'll deal separately with exploitation of adults in the modern slavery context. Now, cultural context and sensitivity. We have to be very careful here and understand that culture is important, but also challenging. And some of the definitions of abuse can be culturally conditioned. There's a diversity in child rearing and disciplinary practices among cultures. There's a difference in places, the value that cultures place on children. the attitudes to children as economic assets. In other words, the more children you have, the more opportunity you have for wealth for the family. The acceptable manner within a culture of dealing with conflict and obedience between a child and parent and guardian. There's the problem in places of children becoming sexualised at a very early age. There are issues of peer-to-peer sexual activity, intrafamilial and among siblings, and then attitudes towards women that leads to violence. And affecting our judgment is the influence of standards that apply in what I call weird countries. These are Western educated, industrialised, rich and democratic countries. So we'll use that word weird in that context. Western educated, industrialised, rich and democratic countries. And we have to avoid two extremes. The first is a form of Western imperialism where we assume that all aspects of our culture are without blemish and can be imposed on everyone else. The other extreme is a form of cultural relativism, where culture becomes an excuse for conduct which by any objective standard is an affront to human dignity. And that's what the Pope was talking about in that quote that I gave you. So we need to I'll just give you a few examples of some of these cultural issues that we can make the conversation a little more concrete. A few years ago, I was visiting Pakistan and I was invited to give a talk to the parish youth group. There were about 200 young adults, students and workers in the hall. The girls all sat on one side of the central aisle and the boys all sat on the other side. That's just a cultural factor they take for granted. Then at question time, a young lady in her early 20s put to me this question. She said, Father Brian, she said, what happens in Australia if a girl doesn't want to marry the boy? I had to think about that for a minute. And I sort of bumbled through, well, that doesn't really happen very much in Australia. But later in a small group discussion, the same question resurfaced. And one of the young women, a university student, made this comment. She said, but my father would never choose someone for me to marry who was not suitable. So how do we then approach something that's so very culturally ingrained, such as arranged marriage? And then we ask the question, which is preferable? That we marry the person we love or we love the person we marry? So the link between marriage and romance has a complex history. And if you're a devotee of Jane Austen, as my sister is, you'll know what I'm talking about. But what is the model of romantic relationships as that relates to marriage? But to take a more extreme form of cultural practice, which we would say is abusive by any reckoning, that's what I mentioned earlier, female genital mutilation. Quite rightly, our legal system has criminalised the practice. The World Health Organization reports that according to available data from 30 countries where FGM is practiced in the Western, Eastern and Northern Eastern regions of Africa and some countries in the Middle East and Asia, more than 200 million girls and women alive today have been subjected to the practice, with more than 3 million girls estimated to be at risk annually. Now, this has been condemned universally by the World Health Organization in a resolution which was passed in 2013, and there are ongoing global campaigns aimed at stopping FGM. But to illustrate the complexity of the issue, in those cultures where it's commonly practiced, women who have undergone the procedure are often held in higher esteem. And of course, that's an attitude which regrettably only serves to reinforce the practice. So understanding issues relating then to the freedom or dignity of women also requires some cultural sensitivity. Judging the agency of a woman or mother, her role in a family by weird standards, by our standards, should be done a little warily. There are cultures, for example, where the woman manages all of the economics of the household, where the breadwinner hands over all his money to the woman from what he's earned, and she decides and apportions the money where necessary and hands it back to him when he wants it. An example of that, and it's often in some of the Indigenous communities. Patrick Fox, who works in my organisation and works in this area of cultural sensitivity, gave me the example of the Indigenous people in Guatemala where he worked, where that was the practice. So the woman may well consider herself, notwithstanding appearances, to really be the head of the domestic family and control the family. So the appearances need to be properly understood. Another example is the question of what we might call personal space. Australian culture tends to be fairly private there. This means that relative to more public cultures, Australians touch very little or not at all. We stand back, we tend to give each other space. But for other cultures that are more strongly public, handshakes, hugs, kisses on the cheek, standing close, and possibly brushing against people, holding an arm or a hand while talking or walking, even between people of the same sex, is very common and even necessary as ways of strengthening relationships and building trust. Now, the heightened awareness of physical and sexual abuse in Australia could lead us to over-interpreting some of those local customs of touching. Now, while maintaining vigilance and educating around awareness, it's good to have sometimes a local cultural mentor who can be included in training so that we can decipher some of these local codes and customs. I want to then say something now about children in residential care. You've all heard about orphanages, and here we need to avoid two extremes, that all orphanages are bad or that orphanages can't be subject to scrutiny. And I draw on an article I published in Eureka Street in 2017. That the Sydney Morning Herald in August that year, Lindsay Murdoch reported on the public hearing of the Australian Parliament's Joint Committee investigating a modern slavery act. His article focused on one particular aspect, the institutionalisation of children, and he detailed the concern of witnesses that an industry had developed around so-called orphanages that exploit children for the sake of commercial gain. People are duped into giving donations or volunteering in circumstances that exacerbate the plight of children rather than serve their best interests. And in the international journal Crux, many of you will be familiar with, also that time, Sean Callaghan and Georgette Muir and Philip Goldman wrote an article headed "The Orphan Myth, Exposing the Truth About Orphanages." Now, in Australia, we are very familiar with the harm that institutionalisation can do to children. And while the child migrant program of the 1940s and 50s, involving the British government bringing children to the sunshine of Australia to give them a new start, was well-meaning, we're now much more familiar with some of its tragic outcomes, not to mention, of course, the experience of Aboriginal children taken from their parents. In 1992, the New South Wales government appointed John Usher, who I mentioned earlier, to head a committee, and the Usher report, as it came to be known, strongly recommended a move away from residential care as the default position for children separated from their parents. And the sad truth is that separation from parents and culture can be very damaging. The issue was recognised by the Australian Council for International Development, and it had a resolution in 2016. And what it did was it called on members to take measures to ensure they are not directly or indirectly contributing to the unnecessary institutionalisation of children through programming, funding or volunteering activities, and called on the Australian government to work with NGO policy and practice experts to address the issues contributing to the overuse of residential care overseas within Australia's aid program, charity sector, volunteering and tourism sectors. But here I caution, we have a problem about terminology and categorisation, and we have to look exactly at what we mean by an orphanage. We need to make the distinction between three types of institution: the orphanage, boarding schools and student hostels, as they all cater to different groups, and the value and the support they merit needs to be assessed accordingly. A family's decision, for example, to send a child away to a boarding school for a better education or for the opportunity for better healthcare is not necessarily an abandonment of that child by those parents. Obviously, it's laudable that they want to give their children better opportunities, better that could be done in a school locally, but that's not always possible. But in some cases, imaginative alternatives to school give young people access to education locally. Catholic Mission, for example, supports the Daughters of Charity in Cambodia, where locally formed teachers take a tuk-tuk out to small communities, providing children with lessons in language, hygiene, life skills, children's rights and cultural heritage, and provide meals for healthy eating. Excuse me. That mobile tuk-tuk education centre allows children to access education and helps them avoid that possibility of falling victim to the reality of prostitution, child trafficking and drugs. But in some cases, institutional care is really the only viable option. Again, an example in Cambodia, a group of children suffering from HIV who have nowhere to go. They face the stigma attached to them because of their condition, with relatives unwilling to accept them into their homes, and they send them out onto the streets. And in this case, the church is one of the only places where children can go, and that's where we have what we would call an orphanage in the traditional sense. So the right approach, I think, is to understand the orphanage as the last resort, a place for children with no other available living situation. It should only exist where it's necessary and not merely because it's expedient. And one should never, I think, establish or promote an orphanage because of the capacity to attract sympathy and donations from visitors. So we make the distinction then between those three types of institution: orphanage, boarding schools and hostels. Another matter that requires some understanding is the culture of corruption or bribery in some places. In some countries, what Australians call a bribe is euphemistically called an expedition fee, an expedited fee or an express fee. Pay me a bit more money and what you need will be done more quickly. But if you want your passport in Australia more quickly, you'll pay another $252. Is that a priority processing fee or is it a bribe to the official to make it happen? Of course, it depends on where the money goes, and that's something we can generally not control. Another deeply ingrained cultural factor is the pressure on individuals to share resources. Some cultures are strongly collective, whereas Australian culture is much more individualistic, and there can be high expectations in some places for people who have access to resources to share it among the extended family. And sometimes that expectation of sharing is so strong and so obvious that we need to put in place extra precautions of process and protocol to protect people from that vulnerability. Also, we have to understand the hierarchy in different places, that each rung of authority interact with their equivalent counterpart. The right decision has to be made at the right level, and people need to relate to each other at the right level. Just to give an example, we at Catholic Mission financed the cathedral school in Addis Ababa for a development, and they were going to have a big event to open the building and cut a ribbon. And I said to my people, well, Connor, who does this sort of work, he's going to be there anyway. You know, you can represent him. Oh, no. The message came very explicitly. I had to go because the Cardinal was going to be there and the Australian Embassy were going to be there, and it would be an insult not to have the National Director. So I went to Addis Ababa for a weekend to cut a ribbon. But we have to be very conscious of some of those sorts of cultural sensitivities, and also to be aware that if you are dealing at the wrong level, you could have a situation where you're asking someone essentially perhaps to override their boss, which they won't ever do. So they can't agree to what you want, and there will be all sorts of delays. So we're just about halfway. So I'll just pause for a minute. I'll catch my breath and give you a chance to catch your breath, and away we'll go again. So a fair bit of what I'm going to say in the next 10 or 15 minutes is very easily available on the website, and a lot of it's in in the written paper, so I won't go into all of the detail, but just to point you in the right direction of the resources that are available. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and ACFID, the Australian Council for International Development, have expectations. There are 5 policy principles that DFAT require: zero tolerance of child abuse and exploitation, which is obvious enough. Principle 2, that organisations involved with DFAT manage child protection risk and impact. You can't fully eliminate those risks, but careful management can identify and mitigate them and reduce them to some extent. The third principle, the sharing of responsibility. So DFAT requires the commitment, support and cooperation of partner organisations to help deliver programs. Then procedural fairness. Everyone is expected to adhere to that principle with respect to responding to allegations of child exploitation. And then a recognition of the best interests of the child. Australia is a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and DFAT's committed to upholding the rights of the child and our obligations under that convention. So DFAT requires funded partners to have a risk assessment, ensure personnel are trained, have clear reporting mechanisms, and to report any suspected or alleged instances of child abuse to the Conduct and Ethics Unit at DFAT. There are 2 attachments to their policy that set out minimum child protection standards. You've got to have a policy in place and a reporting procedure. You have to take an assessment and management of risk. There has to be recruitment and screening and employment practices in place. And then attachment B deals with professional behaviours. There's a long list of those behaviours, which is in attachment B. I'll just quickly summarise them. To treat children with respect, not to use language or behaviour that's inappropriate, sexually provocative, demeaning or culturally inappropriate. Obviously not to engage children under 18 in any form of sexual activity. Ensure other adults present when working near children, not inviting unaccompanied children into private residences unless there's some immediate danger or risk. Not sleeping close to unsupervised children, and ensuring other adults are present. not using computers, phones, video cameras, etc., to exploit or harass children or access child exploitation material. Not to use physical punishment on children, not to hire children for domestic or other labour. I'll come back to that in a little bit more detail. To comply with Australian legislation, including labour laws, reporting allegations of child exploitation to the appropriate authorities, and immediately to disclose any charges, convictions or outcomes relating to child exploitation to DFAT. But the requirement to develop and implement a child-safe approach applies also to downstream personnel, partners and subcontractors who are engaged by a funder partner. So the managing partner has to ensure that the downstream organisation or individuals and subcontractors and partners also comply with the relevant minimum standards. The Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, it also has expectations, and the external conduct standards apply to charities that send funds overseas, and this does include basic religious charities. I don't have a list of who are the participations in this seminar, but probably my guess is most of you belong to larger aid agencies that are deductible gift recipients, and so you are not a basic religious charity. But where this does have relevance, and I'm waiting in expectation for the catastrophe to come upon us, a lot of parishes, because of a connection the priest has with somewhere overseas, somewhere perhaps where he's come from, where he was trained, do engage in fundraising and do send funds overseas. And many are not aware that there are such things as external conduct standards. In fact, I had a conversation recently with a bishop, and I was telling him about one of his parishes that was doing fundraising for a project in Africa. He knew about the fundraising, knew about the project, but he had no idea about compliance with the external conduct standards. Have they gone through the requirements for reporting, for documentation, for verification, and the external conduct standards then includes an explicit requirement relating to the safety of vulnerable individuals and children. And external conduct standard number 4 requires charities to take reasonable steps to ensure the safety of vulnerable individuals overseas. And this applies to where individuals are being provided with services or accessing benefits under programs provided by the charity, either directly or collaboration with a third party, or engaged by the charity or a third party to provide services on behalf of the charity. So if you are involved in a program overseas, you must comply with, and are sending funds overseas, you must comply with the ACNC requirements. They define vulnerable individuals under the age of 18, or those who may be unable to take care of themselves or unable to protect themselves against harm or exploitation. It may be because of age, illness, trauma, or some other form of disability. And it's also important to remember that a charity's own workers and volunteers may be vulnerable people, particularly if they're living and working in remote places. So the purpose of the standard, very obviously, is to ensure that a charity's operations outside Australia are undertaken in a way that minimises the risk of harm or exploitation or abuse of a vulnerable person. And that's exactly what the community would expect of charities. It doesn't prescribe what those reasonable standards are, which is always a problem. The word reasonable is a problem. Lawyers like to use it, but it's sometimes challenging to know what it means. So what are reasonable steps? This will be different for every charity, but these are the things you should consider. The nature and degree of the vulnerability of the people you work with, the size and number of staff. If you're a little tiny charity, the expectations will be a little different than if you're big like Catholic Mission or World Vision or Caritas. The level of knowledge and how experienced people are in working with vulnerable people. The nature, scale, complexity and location of its overseas activities. The effectiveness of the current policies and procedures governing its activities. Living conditions of staff and volunteers. How disasters or conflict affect the vulnerability of people in an area. You get a place of natural disaster and so on. Things can be very challenging. Then you've got to take into account cultural issues and local practices, and we spend a little bit of time discussing that. And you'll work with third parties. You cannot absolve yourself because you say, well, we've contracted with a partner or someone else is doing the work for us. I want to say something about modern slavery. Lord David Alton is a leading Catholic member of the House of Lords, and on March 25 this year, he said this in the House of Lords. He said, I recently met representatives of the over 1 million workers employed like slave labour in brick kilns in Pakistan who are overwhelmingly Christian. Often illiterate, they rarely earn enough to subsist, much less to clear the loans that they are forced to take out, becoming bonded labour. Debts have been passed down to children from one generation to another, and workers are abused at the whim of their owners, with Hindu and Christian women and girls particularly vulnerable. And I've been to Pakistan 3 times and I have seen this firsthand. Modern slavery is a widespread violation of human rights, and despite it occurring in every country and many industries around the world, it's often hidden. But it affects us all, the food we eat, the clothes we buy, our consumer goods. The Modern Slavery Act, you need to be aware of, identifies 8 serious forms of modern slavery: trafficking in persons, slavery, servitude, forced marriage, forced labour, debt bondage, the worst forms of child labour, and deceptive recruiting for labour or services. But note the difference between child labour and slavery. In the overseas context, the incidence of child workers is challenging, and it has to be understood in the local context. While we don't condone child labour, generally the difference between that and slavery is that there's some form of choice or freedom. But then there's the local reality. In many families, it may well be that if at least one child doesn't work, then there may be no regular income where parents, for whatever reason, are unable to find employment. And there's no safety net as we have in our weird countries. And sometimes the only assistance can come from extended family. And it may well be that the child understands the necessity of working in often very dangerous, low-paid and dirty work as it may be, for the sake of the survival of parents, grandparents and siblings. And then we have this terrible choice. Does the family go bereft and have nothing, or does the child or children go to work and earn some sort of income, which is the lesser of those two terrible evils? You often get situations too of cultural expectations that lead to abusive situations. So, for example, there's a need sometimes in Pakistan. I've just dwelled on that because I've got some more first-hand involvement there with some of our programs. Young boys leaving school early to go out to scrounge a living to help the family pay for the sisters' dowries. They have this rather strange arrangement where the girls in Pakistan often have a better education than the boys. They're at school waiting for the husband, while the young boys are put out to scrounge a living. Christopher Lehrmeier of Missio, Austria, my counterpart in Austria, gave an interview to Vatican News marking the International Day of Children Against Slavery, and he explained that firstly we have to have the awareness in the developed countries that there is such a thing as modern slavery that affects many, many millions of people. He gave some good examples of church initiatives to free children from slavery, including offering their families an alternate source of income so that children can go to school rather than work. And a good example was the work of the Good Shepherd Sisters in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They founded some schools for children working in the cobalt mines. Another example is the Catholic Centre for Academic Excellence and the Catholic Youth Development Centre in Hyderabad in Pakistan. Catholic Mission is involved in that. It's connected to the St. Elizabeth Hospital Foundation. And it provides education opportunities for illiterate Catholic boys. They've been put out to work, haven't had much education, and this is an alternative late in the day. And I visited the place, and it was very, very encouraging. These young lads, first step is literacy and numeracy. Then the next step is an education to enable them to matriculate and go on to really find an opportunity. And it's difficult in Pakistan because of the discrimination against Christians. There's not much future in government or business, so it's really in the professions that the Christians have an opportunity. And Father McCulloch, an Australian Columban who's involved in that program, put it to me once very, very simply. He said, we've got to say to the Catholic families, there is an alternative for your boys than sweeping the streets. So how do we manage safeguarding from a distance? I asked my manager of programs what would be his top priorities for managing safeguarding, and this is his response. Conducting ongoing child protection training, not only with the people responsible for implementation of the project, but also for the recipients. And sometimes you might need a dedicated staff member who's responsible for that, depending on your size and resources. Then the preparation of material in local languages to hand out, having clear policies, processes, and not just words, but these have to be put into practice. And while child protection laws and policies may be lax in some countries of operation, that is certainly no excuse for doing nothing. But the legality and whether you're going to be sued is one issue, but the reputational damage is much more significant if you do not address the risk of your projects and their connection to safeguarding processes. And depending on the nature of the partnership, personal visitation is an important part of managing the relationship. There's nothing like being there, talking to people, explaining what goes on. And in that project I mentioned for the Centre for Academic Excellence, part of the reason I was in Pakistan was to do some training for church leadership in governance. And we then drove from Hyderabad up to Multan, and one of the people coming with us was the safeguarding officer that they have employed as a volunteer in that centre. He's in fact a policeman in Pakistan. He was in the highway patrol. So when it was his turn to drive the little bus we were having, we had a good driver. That's another story for another day. But having someone who is actually dedicated to managing the relationships, being constantly vigilant, is what's important. So risk assessment and management, you've all seen that sort of slide, I'm sure, how you go about a risk assessment. That would be very familiar to you. This is from Pro Bono Australia's slide, just a schematic presentation of how you would go about child safeguarding in international development. And if I was asked to say all that I've said in the last 50 minutes or so into one paragraph, it would be to emphasise cultural sensitivity. Let's not rush in and make judgments on weird standards, but at the same time, don't allow culture to become an excuse for what is patently unacceptable. There has to be constant vigilance. A problem can arise at any time, and we have to be very aware. Good relationships with one's partners, so there's an acknowledgement of the need for safeguarding policies, and then a willingness to implement them. That would be my summary. And if I look at my watch, I think we've got about 5 or 6 minutes for some questions and discussion. There you go. Okay.
Fantastic. So there's a couple of questions in the chat box that have arrived during your talk. And if we start with those, and if anyone else has more questions, please put your name into the chat box or put your question into the chat box and we'll call on you. For anyone who is asking and who didn't join us at the beginning, the slides, the paper and the recording will be available. You'll be sent a link to those when they are available towards the beginning of next week. But first question for you, Father Brian. Can you give some examples of how missionaries can protect themselves when working in overseas missions?
I think you need to be aware of risk. So if you are alone with a child and that child then says you did something, one word against another, in the old days, well, everyone believed the adult, not the child. That has changed dramatically. So you have to make sure you are not in a situation where someone can point the finger at you. And that isn't always easy to do, but it's about, for example, doing things in pairs, having other adults present, making sure the way in which you organise the activities, be it catechetical activities, liturgical activities, running clinics, health activities and so on, are done in a way that follows best practice to ensure not only that the children are, of course, safe, but the appearances are very clearly such that you are not exposing yourself to the risk of someone pointing the finger and making claims.
Thank you. The next question was, can you comment on how the Catholic Church navigates working in countries where Christianity is not the predominant faith?
Very difficult, and we do that. I've given a fair few examples from Pakistan because I've had 3 trips there, and there is very serious discrimination against Christians. It can be a bit scary. On my first trip, they dropped me off at a parish in Lahore because my plane wasn't until 2 o'clock in the morning, and the parish priest there is one of those who is accompanying people who are accused of blasphemy. It's very common in Pakistan when there's fights between neighbours that a person will accuse a non-Muslim of blasphemy, insulting the Prophet or desecrating the Quran. And there's lots of complaints, and the people go to court and they're all sentenced to death. And then they appeal and the higher courts bring some rationality to it. Anyway, this priest is telling me all these horror stories. And then I go and he gives me a set of rosary beads as a gift to leave, and I throw them in my coat pocket. I get to the airport. I go through the security and set it off because I've got the rosary beads in my pocket. And all of a sudden I've got this your whole life flashes in front of you, He's carrying a crucifix, going to be an insult to the Prophet, am I going to be sentenced to death? Anyway, of course, the security guy, what's in your pocket? I pull it out. And God can be good, your guardian angel can be good. And he says, what is this? And I said, for prayer, because, Muslims use beads for prayer. And he looked at the rosary beads, he looked at me and he said, I am Christian, you may go. So that was, but there are really serious issues in countries where Christianity is a minority. Not just I've used the example of Muslim countries, but often in countries where Christianity is, like I'm thinking, say, Laos, Cambodia, such a minority that Christianity is not fully understood. And here we have this fundamental problem of making sure the local community understand that the purpose of being there is not for proselytization, is not to be a threat to the local culture, to the local way of doing things, but is a way of being of service at the level of human solidarity. And then we often find too, in many countries, India would be an example, where Christian schools are held in such high esteem because of their equality and they're well regarded. But there are pockets in India, as you've known, in recent times, change of government with a fair bit of discrimination against non-Hindus.
Thank you. Is Catholic Mission looking to implement the Universal Guidelines framework?
I think we have already done that. I'll have to check. You've put me on the spot, but I think I'll have to go through. My HR director is very across all of this, and I'll go and check with her whether that's in our policy framework. I suspect it is.
Okay, thank you. And then we had Prafula, my apologies if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, ask how to balance the child abuse and harassment with cultures in different countries.
And that's
I'd like to know about professional practices.
And that's the key really, is to understand what are those cultural practices. What can we live with and what can't we live with? Now, we might be able to live with a bit of arranged marriage in Pakistan, but we wouldn't live with female genital mutilation. They were the 2 examples I gave. But again, in the context, for example, of disciplining of children, some countries, corporal punishment is very common and regarded as quite acceptable, as it was when I was in high school, where the strap was a weapon of choice. So we've seen how far Australia's come in 60 years or so. Not all other countries are on that same place in the journey, but it's understanding the cultural context that causes harm, and then the education of people as to the harm that this particular cultural practice is causing. And that's a slow process of dialogue and education.
Thank you. Lucy from Australian Maris Solidarity says, great presentation, Father Brian, thank you. Would you like to share how Catholic Mission handled one of actual safeguarding incidents in the past, if you have any, or from other organisations that you know
of? I'm not aware. I've been there 9 years. I'm not aware of anything involving children. I did have an incident where there was a complaint about a staff member engaged in, what would we call it, some form of sexual harassment with a person overseas, and such person doesn't work for us anymore. We have a zero tolerance for any of that sort of behaviour.
Thank you. Audrey Brown says, thank you, Father Brown. She holds on to 1, cultural sensitivity, 2, constant vigilance, and 3, good relationships. So that was a lovely summary. And then Arlene Manaharan says 1 good practice is if there is no safeguarding policy in place, to dialogue with the partners and co-create a customised code of conduct that would help you better understand what behaviour is acceptable and what's unacceptable.
Yes.
And Arlene is joining us from India. And Prafula says, thank you, Father Brian. Very good presentation and discussion. And Brian Buckley says, in the instance of litigation at the interface of law between home countries and foreign locations, the question of insurance and indemnity becoming an issue in ministry and or formation of clergy/religious. Do you have a comment?
I don't know whether there's any insurance available anymore now. Or if it is available, it would be at an horrendous cost. In terms of getting insurance for behaviour overseas, I don't know that would be available. I'm trying to think of an insurer who would be prepared to take on a risk like that. I mean, it may be possible. I was a director of Catholic Church Insurances for 12 years, going back quite a while, 10 years or so since I finished on that board. And I'm trying to recall whether or not the policy is extended to activity overseas. It's a tricky area, because if the behaviour has occurred overseas, where's the forum for the litigation? Locally or in the other country. I've not had any experience of any litigation, certainly nothing involving Catholic Mission in any overseas place. So I think, Brian, that would be a difficult question you need to work out with your broker if you are looking to try to find some indemnity for that risk, and what the legal system would be overseas, and whether you could get any coverage. I'm sorry, I've got to plead ignorance on the detail of that.
Thank you. If anyone has time, I know we've hit 11 o'clock. I'll take one more question. If not, I'll do my conclusion. No one's going to jump in. Okay. So what I want to do then is, in conclusion, say thank you, Father Brian, for such a thought-provoking presentation on safeguarding in international context. You have provided a lot of thoughts and ideas. And I certainly feel that your presentation will help us better safeguard children and vulnerable adults within overseas ministries. For anyone interested, Catholic Mission, in collaboration with BBI, the Australian Institute of Theological Education, has an upcoming course called Introduction to Mission. It's an online course and it's available on their website. Thank you everyone for joining. You're going to receive another email early next week with the link to the recording and the slides. And your attendance certificate will be available to download from the learning management system later today. But we hope to see you again next month, August, when we've got 2 webinars. Dr. Howard presenting trauma-aware approaches to education, and Matt Casey presenting responding restoratively to complaints of sexual abuse, if you want to register. But basically, thank you so much, Father Brian, for joining us today. It was
Thank you. It's been a privilege to be with you, and I congratulate you in all your good work, and particularly for the way in which you are embracing this challenging issue.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.